Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Education Table Talk. I'm really glad that you are here joining us for what I hope will be an important and engaging topic, and that is this. So, these days, when we talk about teaching, often what we see in the news is all negative teachers leaving, teachers being frustrated, teachers being overwhelmed, and there's definitely an element of truth to that. However, we still need teachers. We still need teachers to teach and to instruct the generations of students that are coming after the one that we have now. So it's just as important to figure out how we train teachers going into the profession and how that profession or how going into the profession and setting up teachers well, hopefully will help retain them. So we won't continue to have this exodus of teachers. And this is why I'm really excited today to have my next guest, who is Dr. Norman Eng. He is chairman of the student teaching program at Brooklyn College and actually my supervisor because I also teach in this program. So first, I just want to thank Norman for joining us and get right into our first question. So Norman, I was mentioning how really retention is tied to recruitment. So how do you see the connection between how we prepare student teachers and how we actually retain them?
Sure. Well, first thing, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here. But just to kind of answer your question here, that's a tough one because teacher retention is always a big issue, and it's going to be that way, especially post-pandemic. Many states, as you know, are reporting increased turnover rates, which is no surprise given the stresses that the pandemic has brought on. So it just means even more challenges for schools and teacher prep programs as we try to stem the learning loss that's brought on in part by the pandemic. So to kind of answer your question, like we have to continue to improve the partnerships between schools and teacher prep programs. That's really the one main thing that we really need to continue improving and trying to do. That means finding that balance between meeting the day-to-day curricular needs of the school and keeping our student teachers aware of kind of the bigger picture that's out there of teaching. That our job is not just to, prepare them for whatever the curriculum is in the classroom and the realities of the school, but really just to kind of develop, thoughtful candidates who are able to design meaningful learning experiences. So I know that's not always easy to hear, especially for schools and our school partners, especially in the short term, because they have realities to deal with. But we are preparing our student teachers long term to have that right mindset. So in the end, again, it's about the partnership that we have to continue developing between the schools and the teacher prep programs.
I love how you mentioned that, Norman, in terms of it being really a partnership, because the universities that do a better job in training teachers, future teachers, are those that have those ongoing partnerships with schools. As you know, as I know at Brooklyn College, we have those partnerships. So it really does actually help our teachers because it's not just us teaching in the classroom, but again, having that ongoing dialogue with their supervisors in the school settings. So I think later on, you and I might be talking about what mentorship could look like when it comes to student teachers. But this gets to that, or I should say this does get to that, where it really isn't just what's going on in the classroom in terms of what you and I are teaching our students, but again, how it is a community endeavor to prepare our students for our student teachers for the long haul, not necessarily for this curriculum, but how to develop lessons around a curriculum or how to engage students long-term, regardless of what school community our students find us in. So thank you for that, Norman. And along those lines, you were talking about those dispositions that student teachers need to thrive. So what would you say would be a quality student teacher preparation program? So when we talk about preparation programs, what should be the content that's embedded in those programs for student teachers?
Yeah, so that's a huge question to kind of unpack here.
I hear you. Broad strokes, Norman. Broad
right,
strokes.
exactly. I was just going to say that we have to kind of consider we always have to consider the broader forces that shape the teacher prep programs, right? And I think in this day and age, I'm talking about like 2020, 2024 and beyond, right? We're probably looking at we're talking about many issues, but let me just kind of talk about maybe two issues that kind of, that will influence the quality, the kinds of things that's in our teacher prep programs. And I think both of them can be traced to the pandemic. One of them is the decline of national math and reading scores among fourth and eighth graders from 2020 to 2022, right during that pandemic time, because we've had a drop, right? A precipitous drop. Like I think it was something like a 7-point drop in math for fourth graders, and an even higher one for eighth graders. Same with reading, not as high, but like a 5-point drop or something like that among the fourth and eighth graders. But keep in mind, like these declines were already happening pre-pandemic, and have definitely affected certain populations even more so. So that's one of the big forces that's shaping things, right? The decline of the scores, right? That's definitely going to affect how we teach and prepare our student teachers. And the second thing is the renewed push for a more scientific approach to reading instruction, right? School districts across the US, right? They're moving toward if you want to call it a more phonics-based approach, as many educators are very much aware of. I know that in NYC, right, where I'm teaching at, the DOE has mandated pretty much that all school districts adopt one of 3 reading curricula, right, all of which have a fairly heavy phonics component to it. So I think that ideally, our student teachers have to be ready to address these 2 issues when they graduate. But in terms of what they need, in terms of the components that's in the student teaching program, honestly, it's a much bigger issue than having education faculty prepare our student teachers for these 2 issues, some of which is completely out of our control. Some of these are broader forces related to policy. So again, to answer your question, it's hard to say other than, we continue doing what we're doing, because when you think about it, how do we prepare students to reverse the decline in reading and math scores, right? Should that even be a goal, let alone a main goal in student teaching? How about reading instruction? Should we, as education instructors, focus on preparing students to teach more phonics-based instruction, right? We kind of alluded to this before, like how much of should we kind of cater to those short-term needs, right? The bigger picture questions, these are things that we have to think about as a department. And I think that most schools of education are grappling with these issues right now, not just in student teaching, but throughout the whole education program.
I totally agree. And for those listening and watching, Norman and I and our other colleagues recently were actually having this conversation for real about what is currently in our student teaching program and what we need to add. And it was a contested debate between those immediate needs in preparing our student teachers, particularly around the science of reading, and also some more, say, long-term needs of our student teachers. Really, and that came down to understanding the role of technology and how teachers are embedding technology that is not only student facing, but technology to actually how it impacts their lives as educators. So, Norman, you were mentioning the science of reading and phonics, and obviously that's particularly important for our student teachers, given that we teach elementary student teachers. Do you see this need for an understanding of the science of reading in particular being an area where teachers going into, say, a middle school or a high school setting should also be aware?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the phonics and the science of reading is especially felt in the elementary childhood, early childhood level, but certainly in the middle school and high school level, being that kind of, phonics serves as kind of the foundation of reading. And then kind of once you get past the decoding phase, then it's all about comprehension. But if we're not able to do that with our younger kids, and of course you'll start to see this trickle into the middle and high school stages. So it definitely affects them. And I think it's important that we focus on what is it that we're trying, what is the goal that we're trying to do in terms of getting students to become more critical thinkers, right? Is it that we're trying to get them to comprehend text? Is it that we're trying to get them to understand or decode text? And for middle school and high school students, it gets even more complicated than that. So I think regardless of whether or not we're at the elementary or the middle school or even the high school level, obviously there's degrees, there's changes in it, but we have to start with that foundation, especially at the childhood level. And then once we get to the middle school level, there's still foundational principles of math and reading and science and social studies. There are foundational principles that students have to be aware of before they can move forward. So whether or not it's the science of reading, there's also, right, the science of math, the science of social studies, the science of science even, as opposed to just the art of. And I think it's important for us as a faculty who prepare pre-service teachers to remember that there is that science part of it, and then there is the art of that same thing as well. And it will do us well to kind of put the two together and not always just because kind of the pendulum is swinging towards the art of reading. We can't forget, of course, the science of reading, the importance of poetry, the importance of other forms of reading as opposed to just kind of the phonics base. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Oh, that definitely answers the question. In fact, it opens up more questions I have, Norman. And that's
Sure.
One, you mentioned the need that we all, regardless of what grades we teach and what subjects we teach, to be preparing our students to be critical thinkers through reading, writing, speaking, listening, right? So with that in mind, you also mentioned, and I should add that even myself, I always tell our student teachers, we're all teachers of literacy. Whether you're a high school teacher, an elementary school teacher, whether you've been teaching 30 years, 5 years, we're all literacy teachers. Because again, if students can't read and understand what it is that they are learning, they'll never actually understand the content itself. So I'm totally in agreement with you on that, Norman. Another thing you said that was really interesting, you talked about this blending of the science and the art of teaching. So when I think of the art of teaching, I think particularly about how we engage our students. What are the strategies we use to engage our students and to give our students ownership of their classroom? So how should we prepare student teachers to create classroom environments that are owned by their students?
Yeah. So that's not easy, given the climate that we're in. If we are preparing our student teachers to go into public school classrooms, generally speaking, and the school districts are adopting certain curricula that is designed to prepare students to do well in tests, for example, statewide tests, then there's a certain script, there's a certain rigidity that comes with these curriculums. So this is one of the challenges that my student teachers face every single day. Finding that balance between being creative, inserting their own voices, a certain distinctiveness to the lesson plan, versus following the curriculum based on what the mentor teacher or the cooperating teacher wants. Because they're concerned with their own students. Let's just say they have 25 to 30 students in their classroom. They need to make sure to cover XYZ topic in the curriculum. And so when the student teacher comes in and says, hey, I have some requirements for student teaching. I need to teach a lesson. I need to create a lesson plan and all that, and then teach it. And that has to fit in with what the cooperating teacher is already doing in the classroom. And sometimes, I'll have a wide range. I'll have some student teachers who tell me that their cooperating teacher is accommodating, that they're able to design their own lesson. And then other teachers who say that they have no wiggle room, that they have to follow this curriculum, and the student teacher must also follow that same curriculum. So there's very little creativity. The student teacher will come back to me and say that, listen, professor, I want to create this lesson plan, but the lesson plan, let's be honest, has already been created for me. And all the instructional materials have already been provided to me. I have to use this read aloud book. I have to use this worksheet. I have to use this anchor chart, and I have to use this, graphic organizer or whatever that is. And so because of that, it's hard to evaluate. That's one of the challenges that we've talked about, is that it's hard to evaluate student teachers when everything is so scripted. So again, that goes back to that question of, what are we trying to do as a school of education? Are we preparing our student teachers to be able to be critical thinkers and be able to come up with their own lesson plans and inject their voice into it? Or are we preparing them to kind of be slotted into the classroom, where they can just, I mean, let's be honest, a little bit like an automaton, that they're following a certain script? And sometimes they'll push back on me as the supervisor, and they say, listen, professor, I need to know how to do this curriculum because this is what my school is using right now. And so there's this, we're caught in a very difficult place as schools of education. What is it that we want to impart on our student teachers? So that's the tough thing. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, to be honest.
I agree, and it's funny you mention this, because you and I have had this conversation offline, and yes, I also get student teachers who are tied, so to speak, by what their school is doing. So I know you do this, and I know I do this, and that is still preparing our students to create classrooms where their students own the learning through the case studies that we're looking at, by having them develop the ideal lesson plan, even if it's just for our classroom. So to answer your question, I do, or not your question, but to comment on what you were saying, yes, I do think it's hard for us to help our student teachers balance that line between creativity and having their voice shared with their students to create that inclusive environment, but still following what the mandate is or what the policies are in the schools that are hosting them as student teachers. So that's where I think having still our classroom settings or our classroom meetings is still important. So even though you and I are observing their instruction, still having those discussions in our classrooms around what an ideal classroom could look like, I believe is hopefully preparing them for when they do have their own classroom and they have a little bit more autonomy. So with that in mind, Norman, you brought up another interesting segue in our conversation, and that is not only the challenges, or that is a challenge within our student teaching preparation programs, but what would you see as some of the other challenges that, as people who are training the next generation of teachers, that we should be advising them on? What else should we be teaching our student teachers?
Yeah. So I'm going to stay on kind of the topic that we've been talking about a little bit, and then kind of venture off into some of the other areas. But I think it's so important and also very hard to kind of help student teachers see beyond their classroom, right? So I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, right? So for many of them, all the experience is that skill-based curriculum that's designed to get students to perform well. And then, college supervisors, our task is to observe, to teach, to evaluate student teachers. So maybe our task is to kind of go back to the basics. So I think that's one of the challenges that we as college supervisors and fieldwork supervisors have as a challenge, is how do we kind of go back to the basics? And what I mean by that is focusing on the foundational principles of effective engagement, effective learning, effective instruction, right? How do we design meaningful lessons, right? Give students more agency in their learning and provide opportunities to master whatever it is that they're learning, among many other things. And so I think these are the challenges. Like, how do we go back to the basics to still get them to design these meaningful lessons, to give their own students more agency, active learning, and then as well as providing opportunities to practice, to master whatever skill that they're teaching. I think these are the perennial challenges that we have, but even more so at a time when we are pushed more and more to make sure to get our students kind of to improve their test scores, for example, because it's hard to do that when it's all our student teachers are surrounded by, right? It's hard for them. It's really hard for them to plan actual lessons these days, right? Because right? Like we said, it's already been done for them, and all they have to do is just pick up that curriculum and then just follow it. But I think presenting the alternative, is one of our biggest challenges and opportunities that we have as fieldwork supervisors. That where you motivate students with some real life question or scenario, and students get the chance to investigate, explore, and try things out without worrying about getting it wrong. These are things that are very difficult to do in our current kind of performance focused culture. So anyway, that's one of the areas for opportunity. But you asked for maybe a couple others, and one I can briefly touch upon is the technology component. You had mentioned that before. That's definitely one of the areas of challenge and opportunity for us. And even things like, when I'm talking about technology, it's not just AI, although that's kind of the big buzzword these days, but even things like augmented and virtual reality, right? So obviously, because we teach the childhood program, as opposed to like middle school or high school, secondary ed students, but even within the younger level, we as in student teachers should be student teachers and the faculty that teach them should be well aware of, and maybe even versed in using AI, ChatGPT, Google Bard, and all these things in terms of helping us learn how to design lesson plans, creating rubrics, and maybe even grading. Now, I'm not advocating that we use it instead of, but maybe potentially as a way to kind of help us build a foundation that we can work off of. That's definitely an area for opportunity. So I think that's definitely a couple of areas to kind of get into.
Exactly. And to your point, Norman, although we currently teach mostly elementary student teachers where there might not be as much technology, or at least at the complexity level that middle school teachers and high school teachers would be presenting their students, you draw upon a really key point, and that is, how do all teachers, regardless of the grade level and the content area they teach, use technology even to make their teaching more efficient? And I almost wonder, and I'm really interested in seeing how increases in technological advancement could actually help our teachers streamline some of the things that they have to do, and if that will actually help stem some of the attrition that we see in our current
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah, that's I mean, the truth is even as we're kind of considering technology, honestly, the bigger question is, are schools of education or teacher prep programs in general, are we even prepared to prepare our student teachers, right? I think that, for example, like, how do we as faculty, right, teaching candidates about AI when we ourselves barely use it or just starting to figure it out? How do we prepare students to teach a more scientific approach to reading when we've been steeped in balanced literacy for decades, for the past few decades, right? Right now in New York City, right? Just amongst the higher ed faculty, we're just trying to get our hands on the new reading curricula that the DOE are using right now. So even getting those resources, it's all new for us. And so in many ways, it's the teacher prep programs and their faculty that need preparation in the technology and et cetera, just as much as the student teachers. Because let's be honest, we're in the Wild West when it comes to AI. We don't know what we're doing. And so before we even get to talking about preparing our student teachers for AI or technology or whatever, we ourselves have to be steeped. And even though we've kind of had the pandemic in terms of potentially improving the way we've used technology, many of us are still not 100% comfortable in teaching or using technology because the technology has changed. Let's be honest, many faculty have been out of the classroom for a little while, so they may not be as aware of some of the stuff that's going right now. There's some really great stuff with augmented and virtual reality that's going on in classrooms. You think the teacher prep programs are necessarily up on that? No. So I think a lot of it is we're just trying to get a handle here, let alone have a well thought out plan, kind of a department wide plan to deal with a lot of the technology and AI in particular. So I think we need to take a step back and try to figure out, how do we as a school of education or as a teacher prep program want to deal with and build the capacity within our faculty to teach these things. That's, I think, the real challenge.
I totally agree. And it actually relates, something you said there that really resonated with me. And it was, how do we teach our student teachers to implement all the various programs that they need to implement, particularly around the science of reading or using technology with their curriculum when we don't even yet necessarily know what the exact components of the reading curriculums is that they're using, right? So this gets to, I think, a good first question from our audience. And Michael Willis has mentioned or has asked us, what role does mentorship play in shaping student teachers' teaching skills and confidence? So twisting that or tweaking that question a little bit, what role do you see mentorship playing in helping us, those individuals teaching student teachers, as well as helping them to grapple with the new curriculum that's out there, to grapple with the new technologies that are out there? So we could even almost look at mentorship and turn it into the word partnership.
Yeah, sure. That was something I was wondering about when seeing this question, because it could refer to mentorship for faculty or mentorship for student teachers. I can talk a little bit about both, but
Do it.
if we're yeah, I mean, if we're talking about like mentorship for faculty, that is something that probably has been touched upon less, right? And I think it makes all the sense in the world for us to potentially partner, as you kind of brought up, or develop partnerships with institutions or organizations that have experience with technology. Does it make sense for us to partnership with some technology company or whatever, who have a history with bringing technology into education and then doing some sort of professional development? I think that's important. I don't think that, generally speaking, college fieldwork supervisors get a lot of professional development. That's something that I don't think there's a lot of it. There might be some, but there isn't a lot of it. You'll typically hear more of the mentorship side with student teachers, partly because they're already in the classroom and they are getting mentored by their cooperating teacher. As a matter of fact, at Brooklyn College, we interchange the word all the time. We say either cooperating teacher or mentor teacher. And so I think students are getting that aspect of it. Are there other areas where they could get mentorship, potentially developing outside partners outside the school to help students? Yes, potentially there is. But I'm also very interested, especially because you brought up about mentorship potentially with faculty members, because I do think that we need that part of it. Like we had talked about earlier, like there's just only so much that we know about technology. And I think many supervisors aren't comfortable with using certain kinds of technology, especially with the new stuff with AI and whatever. And so I think it makes sense for us to develop these partnerships, outside partners, something that we can definitely explore.
And Norman, one other question here that we see from Michael is, what impact or what potential impact can you see in terms of the way we prepare student teachers when it comes to the use of maker spaces, online platforms, or community engagement protocols or venues? Do you see that as a way to develop some of those external partnerships that you were just mentioning?
Yeah, I think so. I think generally speaking, schools are, it's not always easy, especially if we're talking about public schools. It's not always easy to change. It's easy to change the curriculum and things like that. But if you're talking about like traditional classroom settings and then exploring other alternative maker type spaces, I'm just glad that we've had experience with online platforms, especially since it was forced upon us during the pandemic. So at least there's that kind of forcing function, right? The pandemic acting as a forcing function to kind of help us move forward. But in terms of developing other spaces for classroom settings, I think that's a great idea. I think we sorely need those kind of things to get out of the classroom. I think back in the old days, teachers really try to do those things when they had a lot of classroom field trips, when they took them to the park to explore, even the schoolyard to kind of do community walks and things of that nature. But I think nowadays it's much more important for us to specifically, intentionally cultivate these partnerships with maker spaces, for example, with museums, for example, and then actually designing and creating a lesson, co-collaborating with these other places, like I said, these other maker spaces, museums, and what have you, to potentially design a lesson, go there, and then actually have students actually learn in that space that's different from the classroom. It's not easy, because imagine trying to do that. You can do that maybe for a classroom, maybe for a grade level, but imagine trying to do that as a very critical part, a significant part of the school's curriculum. And that's not always an easy thing to do. So I think part of it will be the bureaucracy that goes in there, especially with things when you go outside of the traditional classroom. There are all kinds of, like I said, bureaucracies that might have to, and paperwork that has to happen. But I think in the end, it has more to do with political will as opposed to the ability to do it itself. I think it's not hard to find the right partners to do this with. It's a question of whether or not it will conflict, for example, with all the other obligations that teachers have already, which in this case, or in most cases, it's going to be the ability to cover all the materials to get students ready for statewide tests. That, I think, is probably the biggest challenge.
I would agree. Although I'm still buoyed or excited by the possibility of our student teachers working with cultural organizations to develop those lessons. Because if we truly do want to create those lifelong learners of our students, what better way than to maximize all these partnerships as a community to ensure that our students are getting, that experience. And we're lucky, Norman, you and I, we teach in New York City. It has an embarrassment of riches when it comes to community resources. So I hear what you're saying about the challenge. I think.
But what's funny, isn't it? What's funny is that even in New York City, how many schools and districts do we know that are stuck? The students are stuck in the classroom because they're prepping for their math test in May and their ELA test in April or whatever, and they are not seeing. They're not being exposed to even the simple things like field trip. Yes, of course they have field trips, but these are typically done after testing. And so, in other words, it's not an intentional part of the curriculum. And I think until we find a balance between the two, meaning the testing as well as kind of enrichment, an enrichment curriculum. I'm not even sure if that's the right word, but just a curriculum where it's about the students and really building the capacity of their knowledge in this world and things of that nature. It'll be hard to compete because we always follow incentives. And if our incentives are to do well in the test, guess where all the energy is going to be spent? The first thing that's going to be cut is the arts. The first thing that's going to be cut are these field trips or these partnerships for alternative classrooms. So as much as I am for maker spaces, absolutely. I think even before that, we have to tackle how we plan to balance that within the mandated curriculum that we have, or the kind of the culture of testing that we have already built in for a long period of time. That's tough.
Very well said. But I will say this, Norman, having had the opportunity to work with you, a student teacher is very lucky, despite these challenges, if they end up in your classroom. So if there's anyone that is going to help them navigate these challenges, it is you. So I'm glad that you were my guest here today. And before we go, can you tell folks where they can find you and learn about more of your work? Because they should.
Sure. So I not only teach childhood education, but I also do a lot of instructional training and workshops for colleges and their faculty. So whether you're looking for ideas in a blog or a book or online courses about instruction or even one-on-one coaching. So I do these things, and you can find out more at normaneng.org. In fact, if you go there right now, you can download a free quick start guide on 7 proven steps to plan, teach, and engage students. That'll give you a good idea about how I can potentially help you in your classroom. So thank you.
Thank you, Norman, for your time today. This was great.
Great. Thank you.